Tonight we're starting with something a bit darker, a journey into the center of human suffering, a time when life itself was questioned. Forget the romantic stories of knights and princesses, forget the fantasy of shining castles. That's the fairy tale version that history tries to sell us. The truth is, for regular people in medieval Europe, life wasn't about happiness. It was about a constant fight against daily cruelty, and what made it worse was the cruelty of something you couldn't even see. It wasn't just a sickness. It was an event that changed the rules of society, of power, and of survival itself. Tonight, you are not a brave hero or a powerful king. You are just you, thrown without warning into a world where the air itself could kill you. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I create here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who joins us from around the world. Now turn down the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background sound. And let's step into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1340, somewhere in the huge lands of Eurasia. You don't know it yet, but the sun shines through the cracks of your simple home. The sounds of medieval life, which are anything but quiet, hit you hard. You hear sheep bleating, chickens clucking, children shouting as they play in the dirt street. And the smell, oh the smell, a powerful mix of animal waste, wood smoke, human sweat, and yes, a lingering scent of sewage flowing freely everywhere. This is your world. A world where cleanliness as we know it doesn't exist, where sickness is always nearby, and where life, even at its best, is never truly safe. Before the shadow of the Black Death covered the land, life was already a scary lottery. Life expectancy was low. Diseases like dysentery, tuberculosis, and smallpox killed people constantly. Malnutrition was common. Sanitation didn't exist, and medical knowledge was very basic. Cities were hotbeds of infection, with narrow alleys and crowded streets. The countryside, though more spread out, offered no real protection from disease. People lived with death always nearby, always ready to take the next victim. There were no modern hospitals, no antibiotics, not even a basic understanding of germs. Disease was blamed on bad air, body imbalances, or most often, punishment from God. Against this background of constant danger, the perfect storm was forming, one that would test human strength like never before. Medieval life was a daily dance with death, and the Black Death was about to turn that dance into a wild, destructive spin. Tonight's villain, if we can call it that, is a tiny germ with a name that inspires fear. Yersinia pestis. It's not just a germ. It's a tiny force of nature, a silent creator of the apocalypse. Starting in rodent burrows on the plains of Central Asia, pestis doesn't specifically hunt humans. Its favorite hosts are rats and other small animals, where it causes cycles of outbreaks, lying quiet for decades, then coming back with renewed strength. The germ has several forms, but the most common and deadly for humans are three. Bubonic plague. The most common type. It causes buboes, those horribly swollen and painful lumps in the lymph nodes that give the disease its name. Pneumonic plague. The most feared. It attacks the lungs, allowing person-to-person spread through the air, an unstoppable killer in closed spaces. Septicemic plague. The rarest and fastest. It goes straight into the bloodstream, causing rapid death without forming buboes. The biology of Yersinia pestis is a masterpiece of parasitic design. It reproduces quickly, avoids the body's defenses, and crucially for its spread, it blocks the stomach of its main carrier, the flea. This forces the flea to bite over and over, vomiting bacteria into the bite wound each time. Understanding how it works is to understand why it was so devastating. It wasn't just a fever. It was a tiny invader designed to spread chaos, and in the human body, it found the perfect ground for its destructive power. Modern science has given us the tools to uncover its secrets, but in the 14th century, it was simply an unexplainable fury from God. The dynamic duo of the bubonic plague, and perhaps its most infamous partners, were the black rat, Rattus rattus, and its essential passenger, the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chaopis. Imagine a medieval ship, or a cart, or a trading caravan. Don't picture a clean environment. Picture a moving nest of dirt, waste, and of course, rats. Lots of them. The black rat, smaller and more nimble than its cousin the brown rat, was the perfect companion for medieval human life. They loved buildings, houses, barns, basically any place where there was food and shelter. They lived incredibly close to humans, often sharing the same buildings and sometimes even the same beds, as disgusting as that may sound. And on these rats, clinging to their fur, lived the fleas, hundreds of them. When a rat died of bubonic plague, its fleas, hungry and thirsty for blood, left the cold body of their host to find a new one, and often that new host was a human. A single bite was enough. The flea, with its stomach blocked by bacteria, injected pestis directly into the blood of the unsuspecting human. The sheer number of them was overwhelming. It wasn't one or two rats. It was huge populations living in every city, every town, every house. An invisible army of small rodents carrying their invisible and deadly passengers. The relationship between the rat and the flea was the engine that drove the plague across entire continents. Without these two messengers of death, the bubonic plague would not have been the global disaster we know. Their presence everywhere, their ability to multiply, and their close connection with daily medieval life made them the perfect silent architects of destruction. The idea of hygiene in the Middle Ages is at best a joke. Medieval cities, despite being centres of culture and trade, were also open-air toilets. Streets were public bathrooms, garbage dumps, and playgrounds for children, all in one. Human and animal waste piled up unchecked. Slaughterhouses often worked inside city limits, dumping blood and guts directly into the streets or into rivers that were also used for drinking water. Houses were small, dark, poorly ventilated, and often shared with farm animals. Beds were perfect nests for bugs and rodents. People rarely bathed. Clothes were rarely washed. And pest control was completely unknown. It's not that they were ignorant by choice. They simply didn't have the basic knowledge about how diseases spread. They believed in the miasma theory, that diseases were caused by bad air or rotten smells. While that was wrong, it at least sometimes led them to try to air out spaces or burn scented herbs. But these efforts were a drop in an ocean of filth. The crowded cities, the lack of sewer systems, the use of dirty water, and the close living conditions with rodents and insects created the perfect breeding ground for any infectious disease, and especially for one as deadly as the plague. It was an environment where disease couldn't just survive, it was almost guaranteed. A simple walk down a medieval street could expose you to countless germs, and the Black Death found in these conditions a powerful ally for its unstoppable spread. The Silk Road, that huge network of trade routes connecting east and west, was much more than just a way to move spices, silks, and pottery. It was also an invisible highway for the exchange of germs. The Black Death didn't just appear out of nowhere in Europe. Its journey was organized, following the well-traveled paths of trade, starting somewhere on the plains of Central Asia, possibly in the rodent communities of the Tian Shan or the Himalayan regions. The germ traveled through merchant caravans and soldiers. As goods moved from east to west, so did rats and their fleas, hidden in shipments of wool, grain, or fabrics. The idea of quarantine was unknown. Health inspections were unthinkable. Every stop at an oasis, every market in a city, every camp along the route became a potential spreading point. The disease spread through China, killing huge numbers of people before crossing the Urals. Then it moved along the Black Sea, reaching port cities controlled by Genoese and Venetian merchants. These routes weren't just lines on a map, they were networks of human and animal interaction that made it easy for the plague to jump from one population to another. The Black Death took advantage of the early globalization of the Middle Ages, showing that in a connected world, a local disaster could quickly become a global catastrophe. The same human cleverness that built these trade routes for wealth unknowingly opened the path for history's deadliest disease in the huge and often bloody battlefield of the Eurasian plains. The Kipchak Khanate, a part of the Golden Horde, played a key role in the early spread of the Black Death to Europe. Imagine a declining but still powerful Mongol empire whose military and trade goals led them to interact with the Western world. The plague had already destroyed parts of China and Central Asia, lands under Mongol influence or control. When the disease hit the Kipchak Khanate's armies, the nomads didn't understand what was happening to them. Their camps were mobile, but conditions were perfect for spread. People and animals in close contact, basic sanitation. The plague spread among their fighters, killing many and weakening their military power. However, instead of completely retreating, they used the disease, maybe without fully understanding what it was, as a weapon. It was during the siege of the trading city of Kaffa, a Genoese colony on the Crimean Peninsula, that this interaction between war and disease reached its peak. The Mongols, led by Janibeg Beg Khan, had surrounded Kaffa for some time, but their own troops were being killed by the mysterious and deadly disease. Desperation, or strategy, led to a horrifying decision that would change the course of history. And so we come to the exact moment when the Black Death, until then an Asian disaster, made its way into Europe. The siege of Kaffa in 1346. Imagine this port city, a Genoese trading jewel on the Crimean coast, surrounded by the forces of the Kipchak Khanate. The situation was already tense. The Genoese, a trading and stubborn people, refused to surrender. But within the lines of the Mongol attackers, something terrible was happening. Janibeg Beg Khan's soldiers were dying in huge numbers, not from Genoese weapons, but from a mysterious and deadly disease. The Mongol camps were becoming makeshift graveyards, and troop morale was collapsing. In an act that has gone down in history as the first recorded use of biological warfare, Janibeg Beg Khan, or his commanders, made the brutal decision to catapult the rotting bodies of their own plague-dead soldiers over Kaffa's walls. We don't know if they did it with a scientific understanding of how diseases spread, or simply to spread fear and horror, but the effect was devastating. The bodies crashed onto the city streets, scattering bad smells and, more importantly, infected fleas that quickly found new hosts among the people trapped inside. The plague, which had been contained outside the walls until then, was now unleashed inside the city. Panic gripped Kaffa. The people, already weakened by the siege and terrified by this new and horrifying death raining from the sky, watched as the disease spread without control. Kaffa couldn't hold out. Between the internal destruction of the plague, the Genoese and Venetian merchants who had taken shelter inside its walls made a desperate decision: to flee. Imagine the ships packed full of terrified refugees setting sail from Kaffa's port, leaving behind a city in agony. They didn't know that they weren't escaping the plague. They were carrying it with them. These sailors and merchants, with their goods and, crucially, their unwanted passengers, infected rats and fleas, headed west toward the lively Mediterranean ports that were the heart of trading Europe. Genoa and Venice, the two great sea powers of the time, were the natural destinations for these ships. They were busy trade centers with crowded populations, warehouses crammed with goods, and, of course, huge populations of rats. Conditions were perfect for the plague to take hold. When they arrived in port, sick or dying sailors got off the ships, and with them, or more accurately, inside their cargo, came infected rats and their deadly fleas. There was no quarantine. The idea of isolating sick ships and people basically didn't exist. The spread was instant and brutal. The ports became the entry points, the landing zones of a silent and devastating invasion. The Italian city-states, with their rich trade networks, would quickly become the center of the European plague, spreading death across the continent. Genoa and Venice, symbols of wealth and trading power, were transformed into the unwitting gates of the apocalypse. The early spread of the Black Death across the Mediterranean was shockingly fast and brutal, proof of how efficient sea routes were and how crowded coastal populations were. After the landing in Kaffa and the escape of the Genoese ships, it didn't take long for the disease to reach European soil. Sicily was one of the first points of impact. It's said that ships arrived at the port of Messina in October 1347, carrying sailors who were already sick or dying. The people at the port watched in horror as men dropped dead on the docks, their bodies covered in horrible black lumps. Panic took over the city. Despite desperate attempts to drive the ships away, it was too late. The plague had already taken root. From Sicily, it spread quickly to the Italian mainland. Pisa, an important port, was one of the next to fall, closely followed by Genoa and Venice, the departure points of the infected ships. The disease respected no limits or borders. Ships sailing from infected Italian ports carried the plague to Marseille in southern France in January 1348. From there, the plague spread through the Rhône Valley, reaching cities like Avignon, then the home of the Pope, a meeting point for church leaders and pilgrims from all over Europe. The speed with which the plague moved from one port to another, and then inland, was terrifying. Each newly infected city became a new center of spread, in turn sending travelers and goods, and with them, invisible death, to new destinations. The Mediterranean, once an artery of life and trade, had become a channel of death. In a world without the microscope, without an understanding of bacteria or viruses, medieval medicine was a mix of limited observation, ancient philosophy, and above all, a large dose of superstition and helplessness. When the Black Death began to spread, doctors, if you could even call them that, faced a completely unexplainable enemy. Their tools were useless, their theories wrong, and their helplessness total. The main medical theory was miasma, the idea that disease was caused by bad air or rotten smells. This led to treatments like burning scented herbs, opening windows, and using charms to purify the air. There was also a strong belief in the humours theory of Hippocrates and Galen, which said that the human body was made of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease was seen as an imbalance of these fluids. Treatments often involved bloodletting, purging, and vomiting to restore balance. Imagine someone suffering from the plague, with high fever and oozing boils, and a doctor applying leeches or cutting them to bleed the patient. These treatments at best were useless. At worst, they sped up death by further weakening the patient. The lack of hygiene in medical practice was terrible. Instruments were not sterilized. Doctors often caught the disease. Themselves, desperation led to even stranger and more desperate remedies, from swallowing arsenic to putting animal waste on the boils. Medical ignorance not only meant they couldn't cure the plague, it meant they often made things worse, both for patients and for public health in general. It was a brave but mostly useless fight against an enemy whose name and nature were completely unknown. The landing of the Black Death in Sicily in October 1347 marked the point of no return for Europe. The Mediterranean island became the plague's first major gateway to the European continent. It's said that a merchant ship coming from the Black Sea or from already infected ports arrived at the port of Messina. It wasn't just any ship. It was a ghost ship, in a way, crewed by dying sailors, some already dead, with horrible black boils festering on their bodies. Horror and confusion gripped the people of Messina. The authorities tried desperately but uselessly to drive the ship out of the port, but the damage was already done. The disease had slipped in. It wasn't long before the people of Messina began to get sick with the same horrifying symptoms: high fever, confusion, the appearance of boils, and rapid, unavoidable death. Bodies piled up in the streets faster than they could be buried, and panic spread like wildfire. Those who could fled the city, seeking shelter in the countryside or in other cities in Sicily, carrying the disease with them. The Black Death was not a simple epidemic. It was a silent annihilation, moving at a terrifying speed. People died so quickly that there was no time for proper funeral rituals, not even time for sadness. Sicily, a lush and lively island, was transformed into a huge cemetery. Its fate was a warning of what was to come for the rest of Europe, a horrifying preview of the destruction ahead, with every port and every city becoming a new stop on the journey of death. From Sicily, the Black Death spread relentlessly across the Italian peninsula, transforming the vibrant heart of medieval civilization into a center of death. Pisa, with its important port and trade connections, was one of the first major cities to fall after Sicily, around January 1348. From there, the plague moved north. Genoa and Venice, the 2 sea superpowers that had been the original entry points, were destroyed by the very disease their ships had carried. Their crowded populations, narrow streets, and constant busy trade made them perfect breeding grounds for Yersinia pestis. In Florence, the jewel of the early Renaissance, the plague reached its peak between the spring and summer of 1348, taking away 2/3 of its population, according to some estimates. The famous writer Giovanni Boccaccio, in his Decameron, offers a vivid and heartbreaking account of the city's emptiness, with corpses piled in the streets and the breakdown of all social rules. People fled the cities to the countryside, only to carry the plague with them. Those who stayed locked themselves in their homes or gave in to wild partying, believing the end was near. The impact on Italy was catastrophic. Cities once bustling and wealthy were emptied. Families were wiped out. Economic life was paralyzed. The Black Death not only killed the population, it destroyed the social structure and faith in a divine order, leaving a permanent scar on the soul of the region. Italy was, in many ways, the testing ground for the destruction the plague could cause. Even the eternal city, Rome, and the spiritual heart of Christianity, the Vatican, were not immune to the horror of the Black Death. The plague reached Rome in the spring of 1348, spreading from the port cities of southern Italy. Imagine the capital of a fallen empire, yet still a center of pilgrimage and faith, with its packed churches and densely crowded neighborhoods. The disease spread with the same fury as in other cities. Accounts speak of streets full of corpses, of priests dying before they could give the last rites, and of widespread despair. The death toll was staggering, though exact numbers are hard to know. It's estimated that at least a third of Rome's population died. Inside the Vatican, though the Pope's headquarters was in Avignon, France at the time, the plague also destroyed the clergy and the community. Entire monasteries were emptied, and the church's system, already under political strain, was severely weakened by the loss of staff. Clergy deaths were especially high, as priests, monks, and nuns had a duty to care for the dying and confess the sick directly, exposing themselves to infection. The sight of the Black Death destroying Rome, with its thousands of years of history and its meaning as the center of Christianity, was a devastating blow to morale. Not even the city of the apostles was safe. What hope was there for the rest of the world? The holiness of the city offered no protection from the germ's cold indifference, showing humanity's weakness even in its most sacred places. From Italy, the Black Death crossed the Alps and entered France, spreading like an ink stain on paper. Marseille, on the Mediterranean coast, was the first major French port to be hit in early 1348. From there, the plague moved up the Rhône Valley, an important river and trade route. Its unavoidable destination was Avignon, the city that at the time was not only a French city but the nerve center of papal power, the home of the church leadership. It was a place of huge human traffic: cardinals, bishops, pilgrims, diplomats, merchants from all over Europe. The arrival of the plague in Avignon was an event of massive scale. The city's population was killed in huge numbers, and Pope Clement VI himself was forced to take desperate measures, locking himself in his rooms, lighting fires to purify the air, following the miasma theory, and allowing thousands of bodies to be thrown into the Rhône River as cemeteries overflowed. It's estimated that a third of the cardinals and half of the priests in Avignon died. Panic spread throughout France, and the plague continued its unstoppable march north and west. Large cities like Paris also suffered huge losses, with their hospitals and cemeteries collapsing. The social breakdown that had begun in Italy was repeated in France, with the flight of the population, the abandonment of fields, and the collapse of authority structures. The Black Death wasn't only killing people, it was taking apart medieval society piece by piece, showing that neither faith nor power nor wealth could stop its advance. While the plague destroyed France, it crossed the Pyrenees and entered the Iberian Peninsula, striking Aragon, Castile, and the remaining kingdoms at a time of complicated politics. The Reconquista, that long and bloody struggle between Christians and Muslims, was suddenly interrupted by an invisible enemy that didn't care about religion or flags. Barcelona, Valencia, and Seville, important trade and port centers, were among the first to feel the impact of the plague, which arrived from Mediterranean sea routes. Entire cities saw their populations sharply reduced. Chronicles speak of empty convents and ghost towns. Kings and nobles were not exempt. Alfonso X of Castile, for example, is one of the few ruling kings in Europe who died of the Black Death in 1350 while laying siege to Gibraltar. His death was a devastating blow to the kingdom's stability and a clear reminder that the disease respected no rank. In Aragon, King Peter IV was forced to flee his palaces as the plague approached. The systems of war, government and trade were severely affected. Labor became scarce, farming suffered, and the already fragile feudal structures shook. Social tensions grew sharper, and desperation led many to seek comfort in religion, or give in to hedonism. The Iberian Peninsula, with its multiple kingdoms and intense trade and military activity, offered the plague an easy path for its spread. Leaving behind a legacy of death and disruption that would take centuries to heal, the Reconquista had to wait, while life itself struggled to win back a little bit of normal. The Black Death soon crossed the English Channel, reaching England in the summer of 1348. It's believed that the first documented cases happened in the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset toward the end of June. A merchant ship, possibly from Bordeaux, English territory in France already affected by the plague, brought death with it. From Dorset, the disease followed trade routes and main roads inland. The speed with which it spread was alarming. Accounts from the time speak of entire villages emptying, of fields left uncultivated, and of a sense of dread spreading through the countryside. The plague made no distinctions. It struck the rich and the poor, the clergy and the peasants. King Edward III tried to take action, but his understanding of the disease was zero. Monastic chronicles, often the only written sources of the time, document the destruction in chilling detail, recording the deaths of abbots, monks, and lay people on an unprecedented scale. The lack of cleanliness and the crowded cities in England, just like on the continent, created a perfect breeding ground for the fast spread of pestis. The initial impact was a paralyzing shock, a direct blow to the heart of English society, which was already tangled up in the 100 Years' War. The arrival of the plague in England was not just a medical event. It was a population and social disaster that would redefine the nation's future, setting the stage for deep changes in the economy, social structure, and the relationship between lord and peasant. When the Black Death reached London in the autumn of 1348, the city, already one of Europe's largest and busiest, became a living hell. Imagine the narrow cobblestone streets, the tightly packed wooden buildings, human and animal waste thrown directly from windows onto the public street. The docks along the Thames, swarming with ships and goods, were perfect entry points for rats and their fleas. The city, with an estimated population of 50,000 to 80,000 people, quickly gave in. The first cases appeared in the port areas, and the disease spread with dizzying speed through markets, workshops, and homes. Mortality was appalling. It's estimated that between a third and half of London's population died in a short period. Church bells rang constantly to announce deaths until the bell ringers themselves fell. Cemeteries filled so fast that new mass graves had to be dug on the outskirts of the city, such as the famous East Smithfield, where thousands of corpses were buried in layers. Panic was everywhere. The few remaining doctors were useless. The church, overwhelmed by the number of dying and the death of its own clergy, could barely offer spiritual comfort. Parliament dissolved, courts closed, and the city's trade and social life ground to a halt. London was not just under siege by the plague, it was conquered. The smoke from funeral fires mixed with the sweet, sickening smell of decay, creating an apocalyptic atmosphere. The city that had been the heart of the kingdom became a monument to the fragility of human life. From England, the Black Death continued its relentless march north, crossing borders and inland seas to reach Scotland and Ireland. The spread to Scotland was a particularly tragic case of irony. When the plague was already destroying England, the Scots, in the middle of their long conflict with the English, saw their neighbours' disaster as an opportunity. Gathering their armies for an invasion at the border, they hoped to take advantage of English weakness. However, what they found on their raid was not easy loot, but invisible death. The Scottish army, camped in unsanitary conditions and in contact with the air and goods of an infected England, was soon hit by the plague. The disease spread quickly through their ranks, forcing them into a chaotic retreat and carrying the plague back to Scotland. Scottish chronicles describe the destruction with horror, with the disease sweeping the country. In Ireland, the arrival of the plague was equally brutal. Geographically isolated but connected by sea and trade routes with England and the continent, the island couldn't escape. The disease spread through port cities and then inland, killing the population. Irish monks recorded the plague's fury in their records, noting the deaths of many clergy and lay people. The Black Death not only destroyed human lives, it also deepened existing divisions and made social and political tensions worse in these regions, leaving a trail of death and disruption that would take generations to heal. The irony of fate struck Scotland hard. It went looking for war and found the plague. As the Black Death swept through Western Europe, its relentless advance continued eastward and northward, reaching Germany and the Low Countries with similar fury. The Hanseatic cities, those powerful leagues of merchant cities that controlled trade in the North Sea and the Baltic, became the next victims. Hamburg, Bremen, Lübeck, and other trade centres, with their crowded populations and busy ports, were perfect entry points for the plague. Ships carrying goods and travellers from England and the Low Countries brought death with them. The Black Death respected neither walls nor wealth. Mortality rates in these cities were devastating, with thousands of people dying within months. In many regions of Germany, despair led to the persecution of minorities, especially Jews, who were accused of poisoning wells to spread the disease. This led to horrific massacres. The Low Countries, with their complicated network of waterways and dense populations in cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Antwerp, also suffered greatly. Chronicles from the time describe empty streets, unharvested fields, and the breakdown of social order. The plague severely disrupted trade and the economy of the region, which relied heavily on its sea and river connections. Unlike Italy or France, the Black Death in Germany and the Low Countries was often made worse by political division and the lack of a strong central authority to organize a response. The impact was so deep that the population and social scars would take centuries to heal, reshaping the human and economic landscape of these important European regions. When the Black Death spread across Europe, it did so under a veil of terror and despair that few generations have experienced. Imagine living in a world where death is not a distant possibility, but a near certainty that could appear at any moment, anywhere. The fear was not just of death, but of the way it appeared, with grotesque boils, delirious fever, vomiting, and rapid agony. But the terror went beyond physical symptoms. It was social panic. People fled their homes, abandoned their families, left the sick to die alone for fear of infection. Family and community bonds broke down. Friends refused to see each other. Husbands abandoned wives. Children abandoned parents. People locked themselves in their homes, but that offered no real protection. The few who ventured outside saw streets full of corpses, carts of the dead, and the sweet, sickening smell of decay. There was no explanation, no cure. Prayers seemed useless. Doctors fled or died. Desperation drove people to extremes. Some gave in to wild parties, believing the end of the world was near. Others turned to religious fanaticism, whipping themselves in public to calm God's anger. The atmosphere was charged with paranoia. Foreigners, Jews, the poor, all were possible scapegoats. The veil of terror was not just a metaphor. It was a real feeling that choked hope, destroyed morale, and revealed the fragility of human civilization when faced with an invisible and unexplainable enemy. The scale of death during the Black Death is still debated among historians, but the estimated death toll is chilling. Imagine that 1 out of 3, or even 1 out of 2 of your friends, family, and neighbours disappear in a matter of months or years. That's what happened in Europe between 1347 and 1351. The most conservative estimates suggest that at least a third of the European population died, which is about 25 million people out of a total population of 75 to 100 million. Other estimates, based on the archaeology of mass graves and the study of parish and property records, raise the number to 50%, and in some places as high as 60% or even more. Entire cities like Florence or Siena lost between half and 2/3 of their people. Entire villages and towns were deserted, their houses in ruins and their fields left uncultivated. The speed of death was as terrifying as how widespread it was. People died within days of the first symptoms appearing. Mortality rates varied by region, population density, and cleanliness conditions, but no part of Europe escaped untouched. The plague didn't care about rich or poor, young or old, though the most vulnerable were usually the first to fall. To put it in context, the Black Death killed a percentage of the population that wouldn't be matched by any other disaster in Western history until the world wars of the 20th century. And even then, The density of death in such a short time was unmatched. It was a population blow from which Europe would take centuries to recover, reshaping the relationship between land, labour, and money in ways unimaginable before the plague. Faced with the relentless advance of the Black Death, medieval medicine was, in essence, a medicine of desperation. Its methods were basic, its theories wrong, and its healing ability was zero. Bloodletting was one of the most common and dangerous practices. Based on the theory of the four humours, it was believed that by removing blood, you could eliminate the excess of bad fluids thought to cause the disease. Imagine a patient already weakened by fever and plague, who was then cut or had leeches applied, further draining their already weak body. This not only weakened the patient, but also increased the risk of secondary infection. Another common method was purging, giving laxatives or vomit-inducing drinks to cleanse the body of toxins. Local treatments for buboes, those swollen and painful lymph nodes that gave the disease its name, were equally useless and often painful. Poultices of herbs, animal waste, or even hot irons were applied to burn them, with the belief that poison was being expelled. Amulets and charms were also everywhere. It was believed that wearing certain gems, herbs, or even religious texts could repel the disease. Some doctors recommended smelling flowers or scented herbs to fight bad air. Medieval medicine lacked an understanding of germ theory, so doctors themselves, when handling the sick, became carriers of infection. Was a brave but blind fight against an enemy beyond their understanding, a painful display of human helplessness in the face of nature's fury. The plague doctors are one of the most iconic and at the same time most mysterious images of the Black Death. However, their origin and distinctive outfit are actually from centuries later, not from the time of the Great Plague of 1347 to 1351. The image we have of them, with their bird beak masks, hats, and long waxed coats, is a 17th century invention. At the time of the Black Death, there was no formal profession of plague doctor as we know it today. The few existing doctors, often barber surgeons or healers, simply faced the disease as best they could. Most of them fled or fell victim to the plague. Those who stayed did so out of a sense of duty, faith, or the promise of large sums of money from desperate city authorities. Their methods were the ones we've already described: bloodletting, purging, and poultices, all useless. There were no protective uniforms, no masks, no gloves. They protected themselves with prayers, with burning incense or scented herbs, or simply with acceptance. The figure of the plague doctor, with his bird's beak, which was filled with aromatic herbs to filter bad air, was invented by Charles de Lorme in 1619, during later plague outbreaks. Its purpose was to protect the doctor from bad smells, not from germs, which were unknown. But the idea of these shadowy figures wandering through streets full of dead has merged in our imagination with the first and most devastating pandemic. It's a powerful symbol of desperation, helplessness, and the lonely struggle against an invisible force that defied all medical logic. When death arrived on such an unexplainable scale, people clung to the most powerful explanation they had: religion. The Black Death was not seen as a natural disease, but as a divine punishment, a sign of God's anger for humanity's sins. This belief led to an explosion of religious passion, but also to extreme forms of fanaticism and desperation. One of the most notorious movements was that of the flagellants. Imagine processions of men, sometimes hundreds or thousands, dressed in robes and hoods, marching from town to town. At each stop, they would halt in the public square, and to the sound of chants and prayers, they would strip off their shirts to brutally whip themselves with leather whips tipped with metal until their backs bled. They believed that by suffering and paying for their own sins and those of humanity, they could calm God's anger and make the plague go away. These movements, although sometimes gaining great popular support, were viewed with suspicion by the Church, which saw them as heretical and destabilizing. Pope Clement VI condemned them in 1349. Beyond the flagellants, faith was tested in countless ways. Some withdrew into prayer and penance, others sought comfort in miracles or relics. But many, seeing the pious and the sinners die alike, lost faith completely, falling into hedonism or nihilism. The Black Death was a spiritual disaster, leaving a deep mark on Europe's religious mind, planting the seeds of doubts and challenges to church authority that, centuries later, would contribute to the Protestant Reformation amid the panic and desperate search for scapegoats during the Black Death. One of the darkest and most shameful tragedies of the era was the Jewish massacres as the plague spread, and with no scientific explanation for its origin or spread, people looked for someone to blame. Jewish communities, already objects of prejudice and discrimination in medieval Europe, became the main target of these baseless accusations. They were accused of poisoning wells, deliberately spreading the disease to wipe out Christians, and conspiring with demonic forces. These accusations, often fueled by mass hysteria and the preaching of some fanatic clergy, led to a series of brutal massacres across Europe, especially in Germany and the Rhine Basin. Cities like Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne witnessed horrific acts of violence. Entire Jewish communities were wiped out. Imagine hundreds or thousands of people forced from their homes, tortured to confess crimes they didn't commit, and then burned alive on massive pyres. Despite Pope Clement VI issuing papal bulls condemning the persecution of Jews and declaring their innocence, his authority was often ignored in the hysteria. Some nobles and cities tried to protect their Jewish communities, but popular pressure and fear were too great. The irony was cruel. Jewish communities, with their strict dietary laws and hygiene practices, such as hand-washing and regular cleaning, often had slightly lower death rates in some places. Instead of clearing their name, this only fueled the accusations further. The Jewish massacres were not a direct result of the plague, but a brutal expression of ignorance, fanaticism, and pre-existing hatred made worse by apocalyptic terror. The Church, the most powerful and everywhere institution of the Middle Ages, was not immune to the devastating blow of the Black Death. In fact, it suffered a deep and complex crisis that would change its structure and its relationship with the people forever. First, clergy deaths were astonishingly high. Priests, monks, and nuns had the duty to care for the dying, give last rites, and perform burials. This directly exposed them to infection. Entire parishes were left without clergy. Monasteries were emptied, and bishops died at an alarming rate. Imagine a village where suddenly there's no one to baptize, marry, or bury. The church's system crumbled in many places. To replace the lost clergy, the church was forced to ordain less educated men, with little theological training. This led to a decline in the quality of the clergy and an increase in corruption and immoral behavior. Beyond the physical loss, there was a deep crisis of faith. If God was punishing humanity, why did the most pious die along with the sinners? Why were prayers not answered? The church's inability to stop the plague, or even to offer a satisfying explanation, undermined its moral and spiritual authority. Although some clung to faith more strongly, many others felt abandoned or betrayed. This crisis of legitimacy and the breakdown of traditional church structures planted the seeds of future reform movements. The Black Death didn't overthrow the church, but it shook it to its core, exposing its weaknesses and forcing it into a painful rethinking of its role in a post-plague world. Given the relentless march of the Black Death, the survival instinct of many led to a massive escape from cities to the countryside. Imagine the terror, streets filled with corpses, the constant stench, church bells ringing non-stop. Those who had the means, and sometimes those who didn't, packed what they could and fled the crowded cities, believing that the pure country air or the isolation of a remote estate would offer them protection. However, this massive escape often proved to be a bad strategy. The refugees unknowingly carried the disease with them. Rats and fleas, hidden in their luggage or on their bodies, travelled with them, spreading the plague to villages and rural communities that might otherwise have stayed relatively isolated. The countryside, though less crowded, also fell to the plague, though sometimes with a delay and slightly lower deaths. This chaotic migration also had immediate social and economic results. Cities emptied, markets closed, and craft production stopped. The countryside, on the other hand, found itself with an unexpected flood of people, some of whom were serfs escaping their lords, which destabilized the feudal system. Fields stayed uncultivated, crops rotted, and livestock roamed without owners. The rural exodus was not only a sign of panic, but also a trigger for the spread of the plague and a key factor in the breakdown of the medieval social and economic order. It showed that there was no safe place when death travelled in the air and in the bodies of those who fled. As the Black Death swept across Europe, the scale of death created an unprecedented logistical problem: how to bury so many dead. Parish cemeteries, which had served for centuries as final resting places, overflowed within weeks. Imagine the horror of having to pile corpses in the streets, on church porches, or simply leave them where they fell, for lack of hands to move them and places to bury them. Human dignity crumbled before the size of the tragedy. The solution was mass cemeteries, makeshift, mass graves on the outskirts of cities or in newly designated plots of land. In London, for example, several large plague pits were opened, such as East Smithfield and West Smithfield, where thousands of people were buried in layers, often without coffins, wrapped in simple sheets. Priests, when available and not sick or dead, could barely mumble a few words of prayer over the piles of bodies before they were covered with earth and lime. The job of gravedigger became one of the most dangerous and horrifying, often done by the few survivors, or by those who had been forced into it. The stench of death filled the air. The sight of death carts and open mass graves was a constant reminder of the plague's presence. The need to bury the dead was not only a matter of respect for the deceased, but a desperate measure to prevent the spread of disease, although at the time it was believed to be because of the bad smells from decomposing bodies. These mass cemeteries are today valuable archaeological sources for historians and disease experts, a silent and heartbreaking proof of the scale of the disaster. The Black Death not only killed the population, it also paralyzed the medieval economy, leaving a trail of disruption that would take decades, if not centuries, to repair. Imagine the collapse of the workforce. With the death of between a third and half of the population, fields stayed uncultivated, crops rotted on the vines, and craft workshops were left without masters or apprentices. The shortage of workers became obvious in all areas, from farming to construction and trade. Markets, which were the heart of economic life, closed. Long-distance trade came to a sudden halt. As ships had no crews, ports were paralyzed by disease, and fear of infection was everywhere. The production of consumer goods plummeted, leading to widespread shortages and skyrocketing prices. The supply chain broke down in cities. Merchants and bankers closed their businesses. Land leases became impossible to keep, as there were no people to farm them. The feudal system, which relied on a large population of peasants to work the lord's land, faltered. Wealth disappeared for many, while others, through unexpected inheritances from deceased relatives, became rich overnight. Currency lost value, and inflation soared. The medieval economy wasn't prepared for a shock of this size. It wasn't just a recession. It was a system-wide collapse that would fundamentally redefine the relationship between money and labor, and lay the groundwork for economic and social changes that, ironically, would open the way to a new era. The scale of the Black Death disaster was so overwhelming that it plunged an entire continent into a state of shock and collective trauma. Imagine not only the death of millions, but the breakdown of the social fabric that held them together. There wasn't a family, a community, or an institution that wasn't touched by the cold hand of the plague. Daily life came to a halt. Church bells, which used to mark village life, rang constantly for the dead, until the bell ringers themselves fell. Streets once bustling became empty. The countryside, once fertile, was abandoned. People lived with the certainty that their own death could be just around the corner. The ability to grieve was overwhelmed. There was no time for funeral rituals, nor for individual sadness. Social ties broke down due to fear of infection, with parents abandoning children and neighbors avoiding neighbors. Religious and government authority was challenged. If God had abandoned humanity, what meaning did faith have? If kings couldn't protect their people, what value did their power have? The Black Death was not just a medical event. It was a psychological disaster, a generational trauma that left a deep scar on Europe's mind. The artistic and literary expressions of the time reflect this shock. The danse macabre, Boccaccio's tales, the despair in the chronicles. The continent found itself in a state of shock, an unsettling silence that followed the storm, where survival itself was an achievement and the future a terrifying question. Normal life, as it was known, had disappeared. The Black Death not only brought death, but also the breakdown of social order and a level of lawlessness and chaos rarely seen in European history. Imagine a world where laws vanish, where authorities lose their power, and where fear and despair are the only rulers. With the mass death of priests, judges, nobles, and administrators, the structure of medieval society crumbled in many places. Courts closed, laws were not enforced, and crime could increase in the most affected areas. Cities, with their dying people and streets full of corpses, became scenes of looting and anarchy. People, seeing their loved ones fall and the uselessness of any attempt to resist the plague, wondered why they should follow the rules. Some gave in to a life of wild behavior, believing that the end was near and that there were no consequences for their actions. Others, in their desperation, turned to violence against those seen as scapegoats, such as Jewish communities. The feudal system, which relied on a strict hierarchy and obedience, faltered as serfs died or fled, and lords lacked the labor needed to keep their lands. The lack of proper burials and the piling up of corpses in the streets was not only a health tragedy, but a collapse of social dignity. Anomie, that sense of having no rules or purpose, was everywhere. The Black Death not only killed people, it also undermined the foundations of medieval society, leaving a vacuum where chaos and uncertainty ruled, and forcing survivors to rebuild the world from the rubble. Amid the destruction of the Black Death, human reaction took extreme forms, and one of the most unsettling was that of feast in the face of death, a kind of extreme carpe diem. Imagine the desperation of knowing that each day could be your last, that death was waiting around every corner. For some, this certainty led to unrestrained hedonism. Why work? Why save? Why worry about morals or social rules if death was about to claim them all? Taverns could be full even as streets were littered with corpses. People gave in to feasts, drinking, and promiscuity, trying to squeeze every drop of pleasure from their last hours. Boccaccio, in his Decameron, describes how some Florentines isolated themselves in country villas, trying to live in an artificial paradise of food, drink, and entertainment, ignoring the horror around them, until the plague reached them too. This attitude was not universal, of course. Many others gave themselves over to prayer and penance, or locked themselves in paralyzing fear. But the existence of this hedonistic response reveals the deep psychological crisis the plague created. It was a reaction to the overwhelming sense of helplessness. If death couldn't be controlled, at least how one lived what was left of life could be. It was a horrifying mockery of inevitability, a frantic dance on the edge of the abyss where joy mixed with horror, and life was celebrated with death as a guest of honor. Carpe diem had never been so literal, nor so grim. The impact of the Black Death on medieval culture and society found its most eloquent echo in the literary testimonies of the time. Imagine writers, eyewitnesses to the disaster, trying to make sense of a horror that defied all understanding. Giovanni Boccaccio, with his masterpiece, The Decameron, is perhaps the most famous of them. His collection of 100 tales, narrated by 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, who flee plague-devastated Florence to take shelter in a country villa, is not just a work of fiction. It's a vivid and heartbreaking testimony to the social and moral breakdown that the plague caused. Boccaccio describes the brutality of the disease, the abandonment of the sick, the collapse of social customs, and widespread despair. Another literary giant of the era, Francesco Petrarch, the father of humanism, also wrote about the plague with deep anguish. He suffered the loss of many close friends, and in a particularly painful way, that of his beloved Laura, who is believed to have died of the plague in Avignon. His letters and poems reflect grief, emptiness, and the feeling of a shattered world. He mourned the loss of so many intellectuals and artists, fearing that knowledge and culture would be lost forever. These authors not only recorded the horrors of the plague, they also tried to process the collective trauma. Their works, often written in the everyday language rather than Latin, are not only invaluable historical documents, but also moving expressions of the human experience in the face of an unprecedented disaster, an attempt to give voice to the unspeakable and preserve the memory of a world transformed by death. The Black Death left a deep mark on the art of the time, giving rise to a visual genre that still chills us today. The danse macabre. Imagine artists, with the horrors of the plague fresh in their memory, trying to represent the unthinkable. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a visual and literary symbol of the universality of death. It shows skeletons, or personified, figures of death dancing and leading people from all social classes. Kings, popes, bishops, peasants, children, merchants, toward the grave. It didn't matter your status, your wealth, or your piety. Death would take you to its dance. It was a brutal and democratic reminder of mortality. These representations appeared in mural frescoes in churches and cemeteries, in illuminated manuscripts, and in prints. The details were often raw and graphic, showing decomposing bodies, smiling skeletons, and the helplessness of the living. Beyond the danse macabre, art from the post-plague era became darker and more obsessed with death. Representations of the Last Judgment, hell, and Christ's suffering became more frequent and more vivid. The iconography of the Black Death also included the figures of Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, who became patron saints against the plague, invoked for protection. Art not only reflected fear and despair, it also served as a way to process trauma, to give visual form to an invisible disaster, and to remind people of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. It was a raw expression of the collective mind of a traumatized Europe. The Black Death, by sowing chaos and despair, also fueled fear and paranoia, which unfortunately led to an increase in witch hunts and new forms of superstition. Imagine a world without scientific explanations, where the unexplainable is blamed on evil supernatural forces. If the plague wasn't divine punishment, who was to blame? The answer was often found in the figure of the witch, the heretic, or any other social outcast. Women, especially elderly or solitary ones, were particularly vulnerable to these accusations. They were accused of practicing black magic, making pacts with the devil to cause the disease, or using evil potions to spread it. Although the great era of European witch hunts would happen centuries later, the seeds of this paranoia were planted during the Black Death. People looked for easy explanations for an incomprehensible horror, and the witch scapegoat offered an outlet for frustration and fear. At the same time, superstitions soared. People turned to amulets, spells, strange rituals, and all sorts of magical practices to try to protect themselves. Belief in the effectiveness of certain herbs, wearing certain objects, or performing certain actions to ward off the disease was common. Although the church tried to fight them, popular desperation often overruled official doctrine. The Black Death was not just a public health crisis. It was a crisis of rationality, revealing the fragility of the human mind when faced with incomprehensible terror, and the ease with which paranoia can turn into violence against the innocent. The impact of the Black Death on knowledge and education was deep, and in many respects devastating, leading to a temporary decline in intellectual and artistic life. Imagine a university, the center of wisdom and learning, where suddenly half of its professors and students die. European universities such as those in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna were destroyed by the plague. The loss of scholars, theologians, philosophers, and artists was huge and irreplaceable in the short term. Entire generations of talent were wiped out. Many centers of learning closed their doors or saw their quality sharply decline, as vacant positions often had to be filled by less qualified people due to scarcity. The transmission of knowledge was interrupted. Manuscripts were lost or left unfinished. The production of new literary and artistic works decreased. Beyond schools, the intellectual and artistic output of the time itself was affected. The optimism of the late Gothic and the early Renaissance was overshadowed by the constant presence of death. Art became darker, obsessed with mortality and suffering. However, paradoxically, the scarcity of well-educated clergy and teachers also opened an opportunity for Latin, the academic language, to lose some of its monopoly, giving a boost to everyday languages, which became more important for daily communication and eventually for literature. Although the Black Death caused an initial decline in knowledge, it would also, in the long term, trigger a rethinking of educational priorities and lay the groundwork for a new type of thinking that would flourish with the Renaissance. But at that moment, it was a dark night for the mind and spirit. The Black Death was not only a crisis of faith, but it also brought on a deep crisis of the papacy that would lead to the Western Schism and the rise of conciliarism. Imagine the Church, supposedly infallible and divinely protected, finding itself unable to stop the plague or offer a satisfying explanation for so much suffering. The high death rate among the clergy, from parish priests to bishops and cardinals, paralyzed church administration and forced the ordination of less qualified clergy. This, combined with ongoing corruption and the luxury of some church leaders, fueled deep discontent among the faithful. Trust in papal authority, already weakened by the Avignon papacy, the exile of the popes in France, was further eroded. People wondered why prayer didn't work and why their spiritual leaders couldn't offer comfort or protection. The climax of this crisis came with the Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, when the Church had 2 and even 3 rival popes, each claiming to be the true successor of Peter and excommunicating the others. This spectacle of disunity and rivalry at the top of the Church was a devastating blow to its reputation and authority. The crisis of the papacy, made worse by the Black Death, led to a movement known as conciliarism, which argued that supreme authority in the Church lay in a general council of bishops, not in the Pope. Although conciliarism ultimately didn't prevail, the Black Death planted the seeds of discontent and questioning of authority, paving the way for even greater challenges to the Catholic Church's power centuries later during the Protestant Reformation. The Black Death left a devastating and moving legacy in the form of a generation of orphaned children. Imagine the scale. Millions of children lost one or both parents in a short period. Entire villages saw their child populations destroyed by the plague, while others were left completely alone. There were no social welfare systems or large-scale organized orphanages as we know them today. Most orphaned children were left to the care of distant relatives, the local community, or the charity of the Church, if these systems were still standing and not also destroyed. Many were abandoned or forced to fend for themselves at a very young age. This generation of orphans grew up in a deeply traumatized world, with a raw understanding of the fragility of life and the constant presence of death. Many of them had to take on adult responsibilities early, working in the fields or cities from a very young age and adapting to a brutal reality. Their education, if they had any, was often interrupted. The long-term psychological impact on these children is impossible to measure. They lived with the memory of massive loss and the panic that came with it. This generation, marked by trauma, was also forced to rebuild society from its foundations, to fill the gaps left by their elders. Although exact statistics are hard to find, the trail of children orphaned by the Black Death is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the pandemic, a silent reminder of the interrupted lives and uncertain futures that many had to face. The Black Death was not only a disaster for those who died, but also a transforming force for those who survived. The Black Death was not only a disaster for those who died, but also a transforming force for those who survived. Especially regarding property and inheritances. Imagine that half the adult population in your village disappears. The result was a massive rearrangement of property and wealth. Those who survived often found themselves inheriting goods, land, or even titles from relatives who had died from the plague. The figure of the unexpected heir became common. Lands that had been in one family for generations could pass to a cousin or even a stranger if the direct line of succession died out. Entire villages were deserted, and their lands, houses, and goods were left ownerless, which often led to property disputes and the buying of land at very low prices by the few surviving people with money. The absence of owners also meant that much property fell apart or was looted. The population collapse also meant that the value of land drastically decreased, while the value of labor skyrocketed. This change in the relationship between land and labor was one of the most significant economic results of the plague. For some, the plague was a horrifying opportunity for social and economic rise, allowing them to acquire lands and riches they otherwise could never have obtained. But for most, even those who survived, the plague meant the loss of loved ones and a life marked by trauma and uncertainty, where material wealth, though welcome, couldn't make up for the deep human loss. After the passing of the Black Death, one of the most unsettling visual legacies was the silence of empty villages. Imagine a landscape where just months ago, vibrant villages flourished with the sound of rural life, the bleating of sheep, the singing of birds, the murmur of conversations. Now, only the wind whistles through the broken doors of abandoned houses. The fields, once carefully cultivated, had become expanses of weeds. Watermills stopped, their wooden wheels mouldy and still. Churches, with their silent bell towers, stood as monuments to disappeared congregations. Historical and archaeological records confirm the existence of thousands of depopulated villages or plague-depopulated areas across Europe, especially in England, France, and Germany. Some of these villages were never repopulated, and their ruins still stand as witnesses to the disaster. Today, the scale of depopulation was so great that it radically changed the rural landscape. Land that was once farmland went back to nature, becoming pastures or forests. This abandonment was not only a symbol of human destruction, but also had deep economic effects as farming production plummeted. The silence of these ghost towns was not just the absence of noise, it was the silent scream of millions of lost lives, a real manifestation of the fragility of civilization, and a grim reminder that nature, in its fury, can erase the traces of humanity with brutal indifference. It was a living monument to an era of death. One of the most immediate and deep results of the Black Death was the drastic shortage of labor throughout Europe. Imagine that suddenly half the workers in your region disappear. This created a completely new economic dynamic, one where, for the first time in centuries, labor was more valuable than land. Before the plague, Europe had a relative overpopulation, which kept wages low and most of the population in serfdom. But after the plague, the situation reversed completely. Surviving peasants and craftsmen found themselves in an unprecedented position of power. They could now negotiate. If a feudal lord didn't offer them better conditions or wages, they could simply go to another property where wages were higher. Cities competed to attract workers. The result was a significant increase in real wages for manual laborers. Chronicles from the time are full of complaints from lords and guilds about the arrogance of workers who now demanded higher wages and better conditions. Governments tried to resist this trend. In England, for example, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 tried to fix wages at pre-plague levels, but these laws were largely useless. The labour shortage not only transformed the economy, it also undermined the social and political structures of feudalism, giving more power to the lower classes and laying the groundwork for a more mobile and less rigidly divided society. The massive suffering of the plague, ironically, led to an improvement in the quality of life for surviving workers. The labour shortage brought about by the Black Death acted as a decisive trigger for the end of serfdom, a system that had dominated feudal Europe for centuries. Imagine millions of people tied to the land, forced to work for a lord in exchange for protection and a small plot of land. The Black Death broke these chains. With the sharp reduction of the peasant population, feudal lords found themselves in an impossible situation. Their lands lay uncultivated, their rents decreased, and their incomes plummeted. They could no longer afford to be so demanding. Surviving peasants, aware of their newfound bargaining power, began to demand better conditions. Many refused to perform the forced labour, corvée, that was part of their serfdom, or simply fled to other properties where they were offered wages instead of forced labour. Faced with the threat of economic ruin, many lords were forced to change service obligations for money payments, rents, or even to sell land and allow the freedom of their serfs in exchange for money. The demand for labour was so high that peasants could, for the first time, choose which lord to serve and at what price. Although serfdom did not disappear overnight and persisted in some regions, especially in Eastern Europe, for centuries, its decline in Western Europe greatly sped up after the Black Death. The population disaster, ironically, granted peasants a degree of freedom and social mobility they could not have imagined before the plague, transforming the basic structure of feudal society and paving the way for the emergence of a more money-based and wage labor economy. The scarcity of labor and the growing bargaining power of peasants, a direct result of the Black Death, were not always met with gratitude by the ruling class. In fact, they often led to tensions and a series of violent peasant revolts across Europe. Imagine feudal lords, used to having total control over their serfs, trying to bring back old burdens or fix maximum wages to prevent labor costs from rising. This resistance to post-plague changes sparked an explosion of anger and frustration among the peasantry, who had realized their own value. In France, the most famous revolt was the Jacquerie of 1358. Desperate and angry peasants, fed up with feudal oppression and the nobility's inability to protect them during the plague, rose up in arms. They attacked castles, looted estates, and murdered nobles. Though the revolt was brutally crushed, in England, Bottilis' rebellion of 1381 was even more significant, driven by a combination of unpopular taxes, such as the poll tax to fund the 100 Years' War, and the persistent resistance of lords to accept new wages and peasant freedom. Thousands of peasants marched on London. They demanded the end of serfdom, lower taxes, and freedom for all. Although the rebellion was eventually crushed and its leaders executed, it sent a clear message to the elite that the old order was crumbling, and that the lower classes would no longer tolerate oppression without resistance. These revolts, though often failing in their immediate goals, demonstrated the deep social impact of the Black Death and sped up the transformation of feudalism, forcing existing powers to grudgingly acknowledge the new labor and social realities. The Black Death not only killed populations, but also led to a significant decline of many old cities, while paradoxically, it opened the way for the rise of new urban centers, or the relocation of populations. Imagine a densely populated medieval city with its narrow streets and rundown homes. These were the most vulnerable to the plague. When the disease struck, mortality was huge, and those who survived often fled in terror. Some cities never recovered from this population bleeding. Their economies collapsed, their markets closed, and urban systems fell apart. What had been prosperous, trade cities or government centers, could be reduced to mere shadows of their former glory. The countryside also suffered, and many small villages were completely depopulated, becoming ghost towns. However, massive depopulation also freed up land and resources. Some survivors moved to smaller towns or less affected rural areas, or to places where labor shortages offered new opportunities. This, combined with the new economic dynamic of higher wages, sometimes led to the flourishing of new trade or production centers in areas that were previously less important. Cities that managed to recover often did so through immigration from rural areas or from other less fortunate cities, reconfiguring the distribution of the population on the continent. The decline of ancient cities was a testament to the brutality of the plague, which not only killed people, but also changed the urban landscape and the economic and political hierarchies of the time, rewriting Europe's population geography. Paradoxically, amid the devastation of the Black Death, the labor shortage and economic rearrangement opened the door to the rise of new trade centers and the prosperity of some cities that managed to adapt. Imagine a market where suddenly there are few craftsmen but high demand, or a port that, because of the destruction of a rival port, becomes the new center of gravity for trade. The Black Death didn't eliminate trade, it simply redirected and transformed it. With the fall of many Mediterranean and inland port cities, others, often initially less crowded or with better health measures, if they existed at all, were able to thrive. Economic power began to decentralize in some respects. Cities, with access to safer sea routes or intact resource sources, could take advantage of new opportunities. The labor shortage, although initially disastrous in the long term, led to innovation and investment in technology to make up for the lack of workers. For example, textile manufacturing, which was labor-intensive, had to seek new efficiencies. Furthermore, the death of many wealthy people and nobles often meant that their fortunes passed into the hands of fewer people, concentrating wealth and sometimes investing it in new ventures. The demand for farming products also changed, leading to specialization in certain regions. The rise of new trade centers was not a result of the plague itself, but of adaptation to new population and economic realities. The plague was a brutal equalizer, but also a force that, by destroying the old, created space for the new to rise from the ashes. The Black Death not only impacted the peasantry and merchants, it also severely hit the nobility, especially regarding land rents. Imagine a social class whose wealth and power are basically based on owning vast tracts of land and the labor that farms them. Before the plague, the abundance of peasants kept wages low and allowed lords to impose heavy obligations. After the Black Death, the situation drastically reversed. With the death of millions of peasants, all land, once the most valuable resource, lost much of its value. There was plenty of land, but few people to farm it. The rents that lords could collect plummeted. Surviving peasants, aware of their bargaining power, demanded higher wages or more favorable lease conditions. Many nobles found themselves in a severe economic crisis. Their incomes drastically decreased, while their expenses to maintain their armies, castles and lifestyles did not. Some tried to bring back forms of serfdom or tighten laws to force peasants to stay, which, as we saw, often led to revolts. Others were forced to sell land, take on debt, or seek new sources of income, often in trade or royal service. This economic pressure led to a gradual decline in the economic power of the landed nobility in many parts of Western Europe. Although the nobility as a class would persist for centuries, the Black Death was a key factor in the erosion of their total economic dominance and in the transformation of the feudal structure, forcing them to adapt to a new reality where labor was the scarce and valuable resource. The massive depopulation caused by the Black Death led to fundamental changes in farming practices. Imagine vast tracts of farmland that suddenly have no one to farm them. Before the plague, European farming was labor-intensive, with a large peasant population working the land manually to produce grains, mainly wheat and barley. But with the scarcity of workers, this model became impossible. Surviving lords and peasants were forced to seek new forms of farming that required less labor. One solution was the conversion of cultivated land into pastures for livestock farming. Livestock farming, especially sheep breeding, for wool production, was much less labor-intensive than grain farming. This led to a significant increase in the production of meat, milk, and dairy products, as well as wool, which was a very valuable trade item. The diet of the surviving population also changed, with more access to meat and dairy products, and often greater purchasing power. People ate better and with a more varied diet. In addition, the labor shortage encouraged innovation in some areas, such as the development of new farm tools or crop rotation techniques to maximize efficiency. The Black Death not only destroyed the countryside, it also transformed it, forcing farmers to adapt to new population and economic realities, laying the groundwork for a more diversified and, in the long run, more productive farming system. It was a radical reshaping of the European rural landscape. The Black Death not only changed the population and economic landscape, but also had a surprising impact on the consumption and spending behavior of survivors. Imagine that, for the first time, the lower classes have more money to spend. With the scarcity of labor, the wages of peasants and craftsmen soared, and many also benefited from unexpected inheritances from deceased relatives. This led to a significant increase in the purchasing power of the lower levels of society. People who before could barely afford basic needs could now buy goods that were once considered luxuries. The demand for better quality products, finer clothing, and a more varied diet, with more meat and dairy products, increased. This, in turn, stimulated craft production in some sectors. However, there was also a duality in behavior. For some, the experience of the plague led them to unrestrained hedonism, living in the moment and spending freely, as death could strike at any time. For others, the trauma of the plague taught greater caution and a desire to save or invest, aware of the fragility of life. Sumptuary laws, which tried to limit excessive spending by the lower classes on luxuries to keep social order, became more common, but were often useless. The Black Death, by redistributing wealth in an unprecedented way, created a new class of consumers and a shift in spending patterns. This transformation not only affected the economy, but also reflected a change in the mindset of people who had survived an apocalypse and now faced a world where old rules didn't always apply. The Black Death was an event of such size that it brutally and unprecedentedly redefined Europe's population pyramid. Imagine a society where the young and productive population is disproportionately killed along with the elderly and most vulnerable. The plague not only drastically reduced the size of the population, it also changed its age and gender structure. Mortality was particularly high in urban areas and among those with greater exposure, such as clergy, doctors, and gravediggers. This meant that many communities lost a large part of their young adults, those who were the workforce and reproductive force. Birth rates plummeted dramatically during and after the plague, as marriage and reproduction were interrupted by death, fear, and social breakdown. It's estimated that the European population took between 150 and 250 years to recover to pre-plague levels. This recovery, however, was not uniform and varied considerably from region to region. The population pyramid narrowed at its base and widened in the surviving age groups, creating a generational imbalance. This had deep effects on society, the economy and culture. Fewer mouths to feed, but also fewer hands to work. The Black Death was not only an event of mass mortality, it was a population recalibration that redefined the makeup of European society for centuries, leaving a deep mark on collective memory and on how future generations would see themselves and their world. The recovery from the Black Death was not a fast or uniform process. It was a slow and different healing that lasted for centuries. Imagine a seriously ill patient recovering very slowly, with occasional relapses. Europe did not recover from the plague overnight. The population took, as we already mentioned, between 150 and 250 years to return to its pre-1347 levels. And this recovery was not the same everywhere. Some regions, such as parts of England and the Low Countries, experienced a faster recovery due to factors such as greater social mobility, farming innovations, and prosperous trade. Other regions, especially in southern Europe and parts of Eastern Europe, took much longer to recover, or even experienced a long-term decline. The comebacks of the plague were a key factor. The Black Death did not disappear completely after 1351. There were repeated outbreaks, though generally less deadly, that struck Europe every 10 to 20 years during the following centuries, preventing sustained population recovery. The last major plague pandemic in Europe was the Great Plague of London in 1665. This persistence of the disease kept constant population and psychological pressure. Economic recovery was also gradual. While wages increased for workers, total production decreased, and investments were affected by uncertainty. The Black Death was a long-lasting trauma that forced a fundamental rethinking of society. The economy and institutions' human resilience was tested again and again, and the Europe that emerged from this long healing was fundamentally different from what existed before the plague. The Black Death, by destroying the nobility and undermining feudal structures, paradoxically contributed to the strengthening of centralized states and the power of kings. Imagine a king who suddenly finds that many of his most powerful nobles have died, or that their land incomes have drastically decreased. This created an opportunity for kings. Before the plague, power was highly spread out in feudal Europe, with many lords and barons exercising almost independent authority in their territories. But with the Black Death, many of these lords lost their properties, their families became extinct, or they were economically weakened by labor shortages and falling rents. Kings were able to take advantage of this weakness to strengthen their own power. They could take land from nobles without heirs, or sell offices and favors to a new rising elite, often merchants or lawyers, who owed them direct loyalty rather than to a feudal lineage. The labor shortage also led kings to rely more on paid mercenary armies rather than feudal levies, which gave them greater military control. Furthermore, the need to coordinate responses to the plague, even if useless, and the later need for rebuilding prompted kings to create more centralized and efficient systems to collect taxes, deliver justice, and keep order. The Black Death didn't overthrow feudalism overnight, but it was a decisive blow that sped up its decline and paved the way for the era of nation-states and absolute monarchies, power moved from feudal castles to royal palaces. As we've already suggested, the Black Death was an existential blow to feudalism, the dominant social, economic, and political system in medieval Europe. Imagine a social pyramid with the king at the top, followed by the landed nobility, and at the base, the vast majority of the population, the peasants and serfs tied to the land. The plague, by killing millions of peasants, shattered the foundations of this pyramid. The labor shortage, as we saw, gave unprecedented bargaining power to the survivors, allowing them to demand higher wages, change services for money, or even flee the land. This undermined the essence of serfdom, which was the economic pillar of feudalism. Feudal lords, who once depended on the abundance of labor to farm their lands, found themselves with decreasing incomes and an inability to enforce old obligations. Many were forced to sell land or free their serfs. The population collapse also meant a disruption in loyalty and military service. Nobles, who owed military service to the king, often struggled to raise their men for war. This led to an increased reliance on mercenary armies paid directly by kings, which, as we mentioned, strengthened centralized power. Although feudalism did not disappear immediately, and its traces persisted for centuries, the Black Death was the trigger for its sped-up decline in Western Europe. It opened a path toward a more mobile society, more based on money and contract than on birth status and forced service, a fundamental change that would set the stage for the modern era. The Black Death was not only a crisis of faith, but it also brought on a deep crisis of the papacy that would lead to the Western Schism and the rise of conciliarism. Imagine the Church, supposedly infallible and divinely protected, finding itself unable to stop the plague or offer a satisfying explanation for so much suffering. The high death rate among the clergy, from parish priests to bishops and cardinals, paralyzed church administration and forced the ordination of less qualified clergy. This, combined with ongoing corruption and the luxury of some church leaders, fueled deep discontent among the faithful. Trust in papal authority, already weakened by the Avignon papacy, the exile of the popes in France, was further eroded. People wondered why prayer didn't work and why their spiritual leaders couldn't offer comfort or protection. The climax of this crisis came with the Western Schism, 1300 to 1417, when the Church had 2 and even 3 rival popes, each claiming to be the true successor of Peter and excommunicating the others. This spectacle of disunity and rivalry at the top of the Church was a devastating blow to its reputation and authority. The crisis of the papacy, made worse by the Black Death, led to a movement known as conciliarism, which argued that supreme authority in the Church lay in a general council of bishops, not in the Pope. Although conciliarism ultimately didn't prevail, the Black Death planted the seeds of discontent and questioning of authority, paving the way for even greater challenges to the Catholic Church's power centuries later, during the Protestant Reformation. One of the most significant and lasting cultural effects of the Black Death was the rise of everyday languages and the gradual decline of Latin as the dominant language. Imagine a world where education, law, theology, and government were conducted almost exclusively in Latin, a language mastered only by a small literate elite, mainly clergy. The Black Death destroyed this elite. The mass death of university professors, monks, and scribes meant there were far fewer people trained to teach and pass on Latin. Universities, upon reopening, often had to hire teachers less skilled in the classical language. Furthermore, the need for fast and practical communication in a world in crisis boosted the use of languages spoken by common people. The few who could write often had to do so in the people's language, for their messages to be understood by the masses, for example, to issue orders or record. Will's literature was also affected. Authors, like Boccaccio in Italy and Chaucer in England, began to write their most important works in their native languages, Tuscan and Middle English, respectively. This not only made literature available to a wider audience, but also elevated the status of these everyday languages. Latin remained important for the church and schools for centuries, but its monopoly had been broken. The Black Death, by disrupting the traditional transmission of knowledge and forcing people to communicate in more direct ways, sped up the development and standardization of national languages, a crucial step in the formation of the European cultural identities we know today. The Black Death not only destroyed university populations, but also had a significant impact on education and curricula, forcing changes in how and what was taught. Imagine an education system where the main emphasis was on theology, scholastic philosophy, and traditional liberal arts, all taught in Latin. When the plague struck, the massive loss of professors and students, combined with economic crisis and social disorder, led to a temporary decline in the quality and scope of education. However, in the long term, the Black Death triggered some important changes. With the labour shortage and the need for professionals, there was a growing demand for more practical knowledge. Medicine, though useless against the plague, was forced into a rethinking. There was greater interest in anatomy and surgery, as direct observation of plague victims' bodies and post-mortem autopsies began to challenge old theories. Although basic, the first steps toward a more observation-based approach began. Furthermore, the loss of well-trained clergy and lawyers led to a demand for new people to fill these positions, which spurred the creation of new, smaller universities or the expansion of existing ones. And, as we already mentioned, the decline of Latin paved the way for teaching in everyday languages. The Black Death did not reform education overnight, but it was a trigger that, by destabilizing the old order, encouraged greater flexibility and a growing inclination toward humanism and observation-based science, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance and the later scientific revolution. Although the Protestant Reformation had its deep causes in centuries of theological, political and social discontent, the Black Death undoubtedly planted some of the seeds of that discontent. Imagine a population traumatized by mass death, which had seen the church, the supposed bridge between God and people, rendered powerless against the plague. The crisis of faith and distrust in church authority, already mentioned, were direct results. The Black Death not only revealed people's physical vulnerability, but also the perceived weakness of spiritual institutions. Clergy. Deaths had led to the ordination of less qualified men, resulting in a less pious clergy, more prone to corruption. The sale of church offices, simony, and indulgences, already common before the plague, became even more offensive in the eyes of a population that had suffered so much. People began to long for a more direct and personal relationship with God, without the need for a church hierarchy that seemed not to have protected them. The emphasis on personal penance, as seen in the flagellant movement, was a sign of this desire. The Black Death also spurred the development of personal devotion and the reading of religious texts in everyday languages, which in turn empowered the laity to interpret scriptures for themselves, without exclusively depending on the clergy. Although Luther wouldn't be born for another century and a half, the doubts and fundamental questions about the Church's authority and the nature of faith, which the Black Death had raised in the minds of millions, would create fertile ground for the reformist ideas that would explode in the 16th century. In response to the devastation of the Black Death and the repeated outbreaks that followed, new public health laws and regulations emerged, marking the early birth of health awareness in Europe. Imagine city authorities desperate to contain the disease, implementing measures that, though basic, laid the foundations for future practices. Venice, a densely populated sea city and highly vulnerable, was a pioneer in implementing quarantine. In 1348, the authorities of Ragusa, today Dubrovnik, under Venetian influence, ordered that sailors and merchants from infected areas isolate themselves for 30 days, a Trentino, before being allowed to enter the city. Later, this period was extended to 40 days, a quarantino, from which the current word derives, based on the idea that this was the time needed for the disease to show itself or for the danger to pass. This marked a milestone in history, being the first time isolation was used as a large-scale preventive measure. In addition to quarantine, cities began to implement other regulations, such as street cleaning, though very basic, the ban on dumping garbage and corpses into rivers, and the organization of more controlled mass burials outside city limits. Health officers or plague inspectors were also appointed in some cities to monitor the situation and enforce regulations. Although these measures were often not enough and late, and understanding of the disease remained flawed, They represented a fundamental change in the perception of disease. The Black Death forced authorities to recognize that public health was a matter of government and not just divine destiny, laying the groundwork for future state interventions in health and sanitation. The 100 Years' War, already underway. When the Black Death erupted in Europe, was a brutal and drawn-out conflict between England and France that, far from being halted by the plague, was in many respects made worse by it. Imagine two kingdoms already exhausted by decades of conflict, suddenly facing an invisible enemy that destroyed their armies and populations. Instead of a lasting truce, the plague created an environment of increased instability and opportunity for aggression. The disruption of farming, the labor shortage, and the resulting fall in tax revenues severely hit the finances of both kingdoms, making it difficult to maintain large armies. However, depopulation also meant there were fewer people to recruit, leading to a greater reliance on mercenaries and changes in military tactics. Troop discipline and morale were affected by fear of the plague. There were times when military campaigns stopped or were delayed due to plague outbreaks in the armies or in the regions they passed through. The irony, as we saw with the case of Scotland, was that sometimes campaigning armies carried the plague with them, spreading it to new areas. Although the war was sporadically interrupted due to disease, it also resumed with renewed fury. Noble elites, suffering from the post-plague economic crisis, often sought war as a way to restore their honor, loot riches, and divert attention from internal problems. The Black Death didn't end the 100 Years' War. Rather, it transformed it into an even grimmer, more drawn-out, and more costly conflict, whose population and economic consequences were even more devastating due to the overlap of war and plague. While the Black Death caused havoc in the countryside and feudal structures, it paradoxically contributed to the strengthening of cities and the growing power of the bourgeoisie. Imagine a city destroyed by the plague, but still offering the promise of a better life for rural survivors. With the labor shortage in the countryside, many surviving peasants fled to cities in search of better wages and opportunities, or to escape feudal oppression. This, in the long run, helped in the repopulation and recovery of many urban areas. The Black Death also spurred a concentration of wealth in cities. With the death of many landowners and nobles, and the fall in land value, wealth shifted to the hands of merchants, craftsmen, and bankers, the bourgeoisie who managed money and trade. These burghers, who had already been a rising force before the plague, saw their economic and political influence increase. They could invest in businesses, acquire properties at low prices, and finance kings, which gave them greater weight in political decisions. Cities, with their craft guilds and merchant corporations, consolidated their independence from the feudal nobility. They developed their own laws, their own tax systems, and often their own militias. Although the plague was initially devastating, for cities, in the long term, the population and economic shift gave them a significant boost. They became centers of innovation, trade, and political power, setting the stage for the Renaissance and the era of large trading city-states that would characterize later centuries. The Black Death, by breaking the old mold, forged a new path for urbanism and the bourgeoisie. Although the Black Death of the mid-14th century was the most devastating outbreak, the disease did not completely disappear from Europe. Imagine a ghost that periodically returns to remind you of its presence. Over the following centuries, bubonic plague and its pneumonic and septicemic variants became a returning presence in European life. There were local, regional, and sometimes pan-European outbreaks every 10, 20, or 30 years. Famous outbreaks include the Great Plague of London, 1665, the Plague of Marseille, 1720, and the Plague of Moscow, 1771. These later outbreaks, although often deadly at a local level, rarely reached the same devastating population scale as the original 14th century pandemic. This was due to several factors. The population had developed a certain immunity, quarantine and public health measures were slightly more effective, and living and trade patterns had changed. The returning fear of the plague became an inherent part of the European mind. People lived with the awareness that the disease could return at any time. This influenced architecture, houses with more ventilation, funeral customs, and a preparedness of authorities. The experience of the original plague had etched such a deep collective memory that the threat, even when it didn't happen, influenced government decisions and daily life. Plague doctors, with their bird masks, though popularized in the 17th century, became a symbol of this continuous struggle. The Black Death was not just a historical event, but also a persistent shadow that haunted Europe for centuries, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of diseases. The devastation of the Black Death, though incomprehensible at the time, paradoxically spurred certain advances in anatomy and surgery, as the most extreme necessity became the mother of invention. Imagine the doctors of the time, unable to cure, but forced to deal with thousands of bodies. Before the plague, dissection of corpses was a rare practice, often forbidden or frowned upon by the church. However, with so many dead and the desperate need to understand the disease, autopsies became more common, or at least more tolerated, to examine the boils and other effects of the disease on the body. This led to greater direct observation of human anatomy, knowledge that was scarce and often based on ancient and sometimes wrong texts. Although doctors didn't understand the bacterial cause of the plague, their post-mortem observations allowed them to more accurately describe the symptoms and internal changes produced by the disease. Barber surgeons, who were less academic and more practical than university physicians, also gained importance. They were dedicated to draining boils and performing other basic surgical interventions. Though without any understanding of germ theory, the sheer size of death forced a rethinking of medical theories. Although progress was slow and the plague remained incomprehensible for centuries, the experience of the Black Death planted the seeds for a more observation-based approach to medicine and a greater interest in anatomy and physiology, gradually challenging ancient dogmas and paving the way for the medical renaissance that would emerge in the following centuries. As already mentioned, the Black Death was the trigger for the birth of quarantine, a health strategy that, although basic at first, became a cornerstone of modern public health. Imagine the citizens of Ragusa, today Dubrovnik, a port city, on the Adriatic Sea, watching in horror as ships arrived from ports already destroyed by the plague. In 1377, they made an innovative and, for the time, radical decision to prohibit all travelers and crews arriving from plague-affected areas from landing until they had spent 30 days, the Trentino, isolated in a safe place outside the city. The measure was a desperate attempt to protect the population. Soon after, Venice, always at the forefront of trade and innovation, extended this period to 40 days, from which the term quarantine derives. The number 40 had biblical symbolism, the 40 days of Lent, the 40 days of the flood, etc., which made it culturally acceptable. The first lazarettos, or quarantine stations, were established on islands or in remote locations near ports. These were places where ships and their passengers were held and observed to see if they developed the disease. The idea was simple. If they got sick, the plague would be contained away from the population. Quarantine was a public health measure that was not based on a scientific understanding of germs, but on the observation that isolation seemed to reduce the spread of the disease. It was an act of practical cleverness in the middle of medical ignorance, and its legacy endures to this day as one of the most fundamental tools in the fight against infectious diseases in a world without an understanding of germs. The Black Death, ironically, led people to rediscover the importance, albeit in a basic way, of ventilation and cleanliness. Imagine medieval doctors clinging to the miasma theory, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air or rotten smells. Although the premise was wrong, their conclusions often led to practices that, purely by coincidence, helped reduce the spread. If the disease came from bad air, then cleaner air must be better, right? And it was logical to try to purify it. This led to recommendations to air out houses, open windows, and get rid of sources of bad smells, such as corpses or waste. The burning of scented herbs, incense, or wood in the streets or inside houses was a common practice, not only to mask the stench, but with the belief that the smoke would purify the air. City authorities also began to take some, albeit basic, measures to clean streets and remove garbage. Although these actions didn't stop the spread of flea and rat-borne plague, improved cleanliness and ventilation, even if their purpose was incorrect, had marginal benefits for general health and hygiene. The Black Death, by making the connection between disease and air, though mistakenly, pushed society toward greater awareness of sanitation and the need to keep cleaner environments. It was a small but significant step on the long road to understanding public health. The Black Death, despite the medical ignorance of the era, triggered a movement toward observation-based knowledge, a form of knowledge based on experience, an experimentation that would go beyond superstition and ancient dogmas. Imagine doctors facing a disease that defied all their existing theories. Bloodletting didn't work, amulets didn't protect, prayers didn't heal. Helplessness forced some to observe in more detail what was actually happening. Although they didn't have microscopes to see bacteria, they could observe patterns, who became ill, how the disease spread, though misinterpreting the mechanism, and what actions seemed to have some effect, like isolation. The practice of autopsy, although infrequent, became more accepted in some places to examine bodies and boils, looking for clues about the cause and progress of the disease. Mortality records, though inaccurate, tried to quantify the disaster. The direct and brutal experience of the plague undermined the authority of medical theories rooted in Galen and the humours, as they could neither explain nor cure the Black Death. Although the modern science of epidemiology wouldn't be born for, centuries later, the Black Death was a trauma that, by destroying old certainties, forced some thinkers to doubt preconceived explanations and to seek answers in direct observation of nature. It was a painful but crucial step in the evolution of scientific thought, a seed of the mentality that would flourish in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The practice of autopsy, though rare and often frowned upon in medieval Europe, experienced a small but significant boost during the Black Death, marking a crucial step toward a deeper understanding of human anatomy and disease. Imagine the desperation of doctors and authorities in the face of massive and mysterious death, with the piling up of bodies and the urgent need to understand the disease that killed them. Examining corpses became more acceptable and even necessary. Before the plague, most anatomical knowledge was based on ancient texts, often from Galen, which in turn were based on the dissection of animals, not humans. Human dissection was taboo in many places. However, the Black Death broke these barriers. Doctors and surgeons began to perform basic autopsies to directly observe the boils, the state of internal organs, and other changes in the bodies of plague victims. For example, in 1348, Gentile da Foligno, a physician from Perugia, performed what is considered the first known autopsy of a plague victim, seeking a cause. Although his conclusions about the disease were wrong, he believed it was a form of poisoning. The act of dissection to investigate disease was an important precedent. These autopsies, although they didn't reveal the bacterial cause of the plague, did contribute to a more precise understanding of human anatomy and how the disease affected the body. The Black Death, horrifyingly, provided an unprecedented opportunity for the study of anatomy, pushing the limits of what was acceptable in medical research and laying the groundwork for significant advances that would occur in the Renaissance. The Black Death and the repeated outbreaks that followed spurred the creation and expansion of lazarettos, institutions that would become the prototype of modern isolation hospitals. Imagine the desperate need to contain the disease and protect the healthy population. The initial idea of quarantine, established in cities like Ragusa and Venice, required places where travelers and the sick could be isolated. Thus, lazarettos were born. The first official lazaretto was established in Venice in 1423 on a remote island in the lagoon. It was a complex where passengers from ships suspected of carrying the plague were held for a period of time, and where sick people with confirmed symptoms were isolated. These lazarettos were, in essence, hospitals for patients with infectious diseases, although their main goal was containment of the disease, not its cure. The buildings were often simple, and conditions rough. They were built in isolated locations to prevent spread, and often had their own cemeteries. The creation of lazarettos marked a fundamental step in public health. It represented the first time governments took responsibility for isolating the sick to protect the community, instead of simply waiting for the disease to go away or fleeing. These establishments, and the concept of isolation they represented, were copied throughout Europe and were crucial for controlling later outbreaks of plague and other infectious diseases. Lazarettos are a lasting legacy of the Black Death, a testament to human adaptation in the face of an existential threat, laying the groundwork for containment practices we still use today. The Black Death, by confronting society with a visibly horrific and deadly disease, also triggered the first, albeit basic, attempts at protective clothing for medical staff and those dealing with bodies. Imagine the need to approach the sick and dead without dying the same way. Although the famous bird beak mask didn't appear until the 17th century, the experience of the Black Death did prompt an awareness of the need for some form of physical barrier. Doctors and gravediggers of the Black Death era, not understanding transmission by germs or fleas, primarily protected themselves from bad air, miasmas. This led to the use of cloths or rags over the mouth and nose, often soaked in vinegar or scented essences to try to filter the air. They're also known to have worn thick clothing and cloaks to avoid direct contact with bodies or bodily fluids. Although primitive, these were the first steps toward the concept of personal protective equipment, PPE. The full design of the 17th century plague doctor, with his waxed coat, gloves, wide-brimmed hat, and beak mask, was an evolution of this basic idea, designed by Charles Delorme. The waxed coat was considered impermeable to miasmas, and the beak was filled with aromatic herbs. The Black Death, therefore, although with a flawed understanding of the disease, was the first great shock that forced those on the front lines to actively consider how to protect themselves from an invisible enemy. It was a lesson learned at an unimaginable cost, but one that would ultimately contribute to the development of modern medicine and hygiene practices. The Black Death, being an impossible mystery for medieval science, led to a desperate and often wrong search for its causes and remedies. Imagine the people of the time trying to make sense of a disaster that defied all logic. The dominant theory was miasma, the idea that the disease was caused by bad air, toxic vapors coming from decaying matter, or from the unfavorable alignment of planets. This led to remedies such as burning scented herbs to purify the air, opening windows to ventilate spaces, or avoiding bad smells. Another popular theory, especially among the clergy, was that the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. This led to prayer, penance, flagellant processions, and, tragically, massacres against Jews and other minorities, accused of poisoning wells or being the agents of divine wrath. Doctors and alchemists also searched for miraculous remedies. All kinds of potions and elixirs were tried, many of them based on medicinal herbs, some with real properties, and others useless or even toxic. Strange ointments were applied to boils, potions were drunk, bloodletting and purging were performed. Some believed that the blood of a crow or a toad or animal waste could cure the disease. Desperation led to experiments with precious metals such as gold or rare substances. The irony of this search was that despite the huge energy and often grotesque methods, the true bacterial cause of the plague would remain unknown for centuries. The Black Death was a brutal reminder of the limits of human knowledge in the Middle Ages, and people's capacity to invent explanations and solutions in the absence of truth. Beyond death and devastation, the Black Death also revealed astonishing human resilience, adaptability, and the will of people to survive. Imagine having lost half your family and friends, having lived in a world of fear and anarchy, and yet finding the strength to continue. Survivors not only rebuilt their lives, they rebuilt entire societies. The labour shortage led to the negotiation of higher wages and better conditions for peasants and craftsmen. The breakdown of old structures opened the way for new social and economic opportunities. The Black Death forced innovation in farming, in public health, with quarantine, and in administration. People learned to live with the constant threat of the plague developing greater awareness of hygiene, though basic, and isolation. Communities came together to bury their dead, and in many cases, to support each other despite the fear. The Black Death changed the European mindset. Although the trauma persisted, a new practicality also emerged, a deeper appreciation for life and a willingness to challenge the status quo. The human spirit, far from being broken, showed an incredible ability to adapt to the most adverse circumstances, to innovate, and to rebuild. The Black Death was the toughest test to which European civilization was subjected, and although the cost was huge, survival itself and the later recovery demonstrate humanity's incredible tenacity. It was a testament that even in the face of the apocalypse, life finds a way. Finally, the Black Death, after centuries of repeated outbreaks and persistent fear, began its decline as a major pandemic in Europe. Although its genetic and cultural impact would endure, imagine a disease that has dominated life and death for more than 3 centuries, which gradually begins to retreat. Why did it stop being the annihilating force it was in the 14th century? There isn't one single reason, but a combination of factors. First, repeated outbreaks, though deadly, genetically selected populations. Those with some natural resistance to the plague were more likely to survive and pass on their genes, which, over time, may have led to a European population with a higher proportion of people genetically less susceptible to the more lethal bubonic form. Second, public health measures, though initially basic, became more effective. Quarantine, lazarettos, and improvements in urban hygiene, though slow, helped contain outbreaks. Third, there were changes in rat populations and housing patterns. The brown rat, larger and less likely to live in close proximity to humans than the black rat, began to displace the latter in many urban areas. There was also a gradual improvement in housing quality, making them less accessible to rats. Finally, some historians suggest that changes in the virulence of Yersinia pestis itself, or in the efficiency of its transmission, might have contributed. The last major plague pandemic in Europe was in the 18th century, although the disease never completely disappeared, and outbreaks still exist. In some parts of the world today, its era of dominance in Europe had ended. The Black Death retreated, leaving behind a transformed continent and an unforgettable memory of its devastating power. The Black Death left an unforgettable mark on literature, from the chronicles of its time to contemporary works, becoming an inexhaustible source of inspiration to explore fear, death, and the human condition. Imagine a disaster so deep that it resonates through the centuries. In the Middle Ages, Boccaccio's Decameron is the most famous example, a direct literary testimony to the social breakdown that accompanied the plague in Florence, where humour and tragedy intertwine. Poets like Petrarch mourned personal losses and general devastation. In later centuries, the Black Death has continued to fascinate writers. Albert Camus, in his novel The Plague, 1947, uses the plague in Iran as an existentialist allegory of evil, absurdity, and human resistance in the face of an incomprehensible disaster, clearly inspired by the Black Death, though he relocates it to a modern context. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in Love in the Time of Cholera, although focused on cholera, evokes an atmosphere of repeated epidemics reminiscent of the plague experience. More recently, historical novels like Geraldine Brooks' Year of Wonders or Philip Ziegler's The Black Death have revisited the era with historical rigor and emotional depth. The Black Death in literature is not just a backdrop. It's often a character in itself, a force that compels characters to confront their deepest fears, question their faith, and redefine their values. It's a reminder that even centuries later, the narrative of the plague remains a powerful lens through which we can examine the fragility of civilization and the resilience of the human spirit. The Black Death left a deep and lasting imprint on artistic representations, transforming medieval and Gothic iconography into a reflection of fear, death, and despair. Imagine a world where death is a constant and grotesque presence. Artworks from the period and later not only documented the plague, they personified and interpreted it. The already mentioned Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a popular genre, with skeletons or personified figures of death leading people from all social classes in a dance toward the grave. These murals, frescoes, engravings, and sculptures, often found in cemeteries or churches, were a brutal reminder of the universality of death. Beyond the danse macabre, themes of the Last Judgment, hell, and Christ's suffering became more vivid and grim. Artists often depicted decomposing bodies, skeletons, and the agony of the dying. The figure of the plague doctor, with his beak mask, though popularized in the 17th century, has become an iconic image of the era, appearing in later engravings and paintings. In devotional art, saints like Saint Roch and Saint Sebastian, associated with protection against the plague, gained popularity and were frequently depicted. Paintings and engravings often showed the boils of the disease, the power of death, and the chaos of mass burials. These artistic representations not only served as a visual record of the plague, but also as a way to process collective trauma, to give form to the incomprehensible, and to channel the terror and faith of a population that had lived through the apocalypse. Art became a dark mirror of the soul of a traumatized Europe. The Black Death, like few other historical disasters, has found a returning path in cinema and television, where its modern interpretations range from historical horror to allegory. Imagine directors and screenwriters trying to capture the size of this disaster on screen. One of the rawest and most realistic portrayals is Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, 1957, where death personified plays chess with a medieval knight in a plague-ravaged landscape. The film masterfully captures the desperation, the crisis of faith, and the constant presence of death. More recently, Black Death in 2010, an action horror film set in plague-ridden England, offers a more visceral and dark vision, focusing on a group of knights investigating a village supposedly immune to the disease. Although historical liberties are often taken for the sake of drama, these productions manage to convey the atmosphere of fear, social breakdown, and brutality of the era. Television series such as The Pillars of the Earth or dramatic documentaries have also touched on the subject, often focusing on the chaos and despair of outbreaks. However, the challenge of depicting horror on screen without falling into sensationalism is great. Modern interpretations often use the Black Death as a broader metaphor for disaster, survival, and human nature under extreme pressure. In doing so, cinema and television not only entertain us, but also connect us with a terrifying past, reminding us of the fragility of our own existence and the persistent relevance of one of history's worst pandemics. The Black Death has transcended the pages of history to become a returning theme in video games and other interactive media, offering players a unique immersion into the brutality and impact of the pandemic. Imagine simulating life in a medieval city, besieged by the plague, or managing a society struggling to survive. Games like A Plague Tale, Innocence, 2019, and its sequel, A Plague Tale Requiem, 2022, are perhaps the most prominent examples. These action-adventure games immerse players in a medieval France devastated by the plague and hordes of rats using the disease. As a central element of gameplay and atmosphere, environments are filled with bodies, boils, and a palpable sense of despair. Other games, especially in the strategy or city-building genre, like Crusader Kings III or Age of Empires, include the Black Death as a game event that can destroy populations, affect economies, and change lines of succession. These games allow players to experience in a controlled way the large-scale impact of the plague. There are also independent or niche games that focus more directly on survival in a plague-ridden world, or even tabletop role-playing, games that use the plague as a backdrop. These interactive media not only entertain, they also educate in an immersive way, allowing players to make decisions in an environment where survival is precarious and the consequences of the plague are tangible. In doing so, video games help keep the memory of the Black Death alive, allowing a new generation to interact with this crucial moment in human history in a unique and often terrifying way. Beyond its literal impact, the Black Death has been, and continues to be, used as a powerful metaphor for disaster, apocalypse, and indiscriminate destruction. Imagine invoking an image of total disaster. When people speak of a scourge or a plague affecting a society, whether economic, political, or social, it often implicitly refers to the image of the Black Death. It's used to describe large-scale events with devastating consequences that seem uncontrollable and inevitable. For example, one might speak of a plague of corruption or a plague of unemployment to evoke a sense of overwhelming crisis. The phrase "the Black Death" has become synonymous with unprecedented disaster. It's also used to evoke the idea of the end, times, an apocalypse where social structures crumble and death reigns supreme. The experience of the Black Death left such a deep scar on the European mind that it became the archetype of existential catastrophe. It's a metaphor that transcends the disease itself and applies to any destructive force that threatens human or social existence. This persistence of the Black Death as a metaphor reveals its lasting power in our collective imagination. It's a reminder of our fragility and history's ability to provide us with a language to describe the horrors we face, even if those horrors take a different form. The plague is no longer an everywhere reality, but its metaphorical shadow remains, long and dark. The experience of the Black Death, although centuries old, offers surprisingly relevant lessons for future pandemics and for global awareness in the modern era. Imagine reliving an event of mass death, but with the knowledge and tools we lacked then. The Black Death taught us the brutal truth that diseases respect no borders, social status, or wealth. It showed how a localized disease can become a global disaster in an interconnected world, even with the limited connectivity of the 14th century. It reminded us of the crucial importance of hygiene, sanitation, and isolation, even if people at the time didn't understand why they worked. The birth of quarantine and lazarettos are direct legacies of the Black Death. Tools we still use today showed us how panic and ignorance can lead to scapegoating and social violence. And crucially, it demonstrated the fragility of our institutions and the need for a coordinated, knowledge-based response in the 21st century with the emergence of diseases like HIV/AIDS, SARS, Ebola, and more recently, COVID-19. The lessons of the Black Death resonate with new urgency. They remind us of the importance of scientific research, strong public health systems, international cooperation, and accurate information to combat pandemics. The Black Death is not just history, it's a grim yet vital guide for navigating the uncertainties of a future where new diseases are a constant threat, reminding us that despite all our progress, we are ultimately creatures of flesh and blood, at the mercy of forces that, at times, are beyond our control. The rediscovery of the bacterium, Yersinia pestis, in the modern era was a scientific milestone that finally unraveled the mystery of the Black Death, more than 500 years after its first outbreak. Imagine 19th century scientists with their microscopes and laboratories trying to identify the cause of the plagues that still ravaged parts of the world. It was in 1894, during a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, when two bacteriologists working independently managed to identify the responsible bacterium. Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss-French physician, and Kitasato Shibasaburo, a Japanese physician and bacteriologist, both students of Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, isolated and identified the bacterium. Yersin was the first to correctly identify it, and in his honor, the bacterium was named Yersinia pestis. This discovery was revolutionary. Finally, humanity had a scientific explanation for the Black Death. It was not divine punishment or bad air, but a bacterium. This opened the door to the development of vaccines, though the first ones were not very effective, and much later, antibiotics, which would transform plague treatment from a death sentence to a curable disease. The rediscovery of Yersinia pestis not only solved a historical mystery, but also laid the groundwork for understanding infectious diseases in general and the development of microbiology. It's a testament to the power of science to unveil the secrets of nature, even those that had sown terror for centuries, and to give us the tools to fight invisible enemies that once seemed invincible. Genetic research in the modern era has added a new layer of understanding to the history of the Black Death, allowing us to trace the bacterium Yersinia pestis through time and space with astonishing precision. Imagine being able to extract DNA from the bones of plague victims buried centuries ago in mass graves. Thanks to advances in paleogenomics, scientists have been able to recover and sequence the complete genome of Yersinia pestis from the skeletal remains of victims of the original Black Death in the 14th century. These studies have confirmed that the bacterium responsible for the Great Plague was indeed Yersinia pestis, dispelling doubts about other possible causes. Furthermore, genetic analysis has revealed the diversity of bacterial strains and allowed researchers to reconstruct the path of its spread across Europe in unprecedented detail, confirming the theory that it came from Central Asia and dispersed through trade routes. It has also allowed for the study of the bacterium's mutations over time and an understanding of how its virulence may have evolved. Genetic research not only gives us a clearer view of the past, but also helps us better understand the evolution of pathogens and how they adapt to new hosts and environments. It teaches us about bacterial resilience and the dynamics of pandemics, providing crucial information for current public health and preparedness for future threats. The Black Death, therefore, is not just an event in history books, but a biological case study that continues to reveal its secrets through the DNA of its victims. The debate about the true death toll of the Black Death is still alive among historians, and new estimates, often based on archaeology and the analysis of detailed records, continue to refine our understanding of the scale of the disaster. Imagine 21st century historians and population experts trying to quantify death in a world without reliable statistics. Traditional estimates, which spoke of a third of the European population, about 25 million people, were based on contemporary chronicles and more general population analyses. However, more recent research, using more rigorous methods such as pollen analysis to determine the depopulation of cultivated lands, the study of thousands of property records and wills, and crucially, the archaeological analysis of mass graves, suggests that the number could be significantly higher. Some of these new estimates suggest that mortality in Western Europe could have reached 50%, and even more in some densely populated regions. The archaeology of mass cemeteries, such as East Smithfield in London, has provided direct evidence of the huge number of dead in a short period. These new estimates, though still subject to debate, underscore the brutality of the Black Death and the depth of its population impact. It's not just about numbers. It's about a rethinking of how the plague reshapes societies, economies, and the mindsets of survivors. The debate about mortality is not merely an academic exercise. It's an attempt to understand the true size of this collective trauma and its long-term effects on the history of Western civilization. And so, as the lights begin to dim, we're left with a grim reminder: the fragility of civilization. The Black Death, an event that marked a before and after in the history of Europe, is much more than a series of dates and death numbers. It's a story about human vulnerability, about the unpredictability of nature, and about humanity's astonishing capacity to survive, adapt, and ultimately rebuild. It teaches us that epidemics can break the chains of society, that knowledge can be useless in the face of an unknown enemy, and that faith and reason can be tested to their limits. But it also shows us the tenacity of the human spirit, the ability to find hope in despair, to adapt to new realities, and to forge a future even from the ashes of an apocalypse. The Black Death is not just a dark tale from the past, it's a warning, an enduring lesson of our own fragility in a world where invisible enemies always lurk. It's a silent echo that resonates through the centuries, reminding us that despite all our progress, we are ultimately creatures of flesh and blood, at the mercy of forces that, at times, are beyond our control. So, with that reflection, I invite you to relax even more, to let these stories settle. History is full of uncomfortable truths, and sometimes the truth is the best lullaby. Rest well.